The Hargrave estate stretched across the hills like a painting, golden fields waving in the wind, fences running like ribbons through pastures, and a grand house perched atop the rise, white as bone and twice as cold. Everything looked perfect from a distance. But as with many beautiful things, the closer you got, the easier it was to see the cracks. Victor Hargrave stood at the top window of his mansion, sipping brandy, watching the sunset spill orange fire across his land. To the townsfolk, he was a man of stature, a millionaire oil investor who had saved the town of Clayton Ridge during a drought 10 years ago. He owned the bank, the general store, the grain mill, and most of the valley's water rights. Folks tipped their hats to him, smiled politely when he passed, and kept their distance. He liked it that way. But not everything he owned could be kept in check. His wife, Evelyn, once the jewel of his world, now moved through the house like a ghost. Evelyn had been sick for months. Some said it was her lungs, others whispered it was her heart. The doctors had no answers, only medicines that dulled the pain. She used to sing by the piano, used to laugh like wind chimes in summer. But now her voice was soft and her body thinner than her wedding veil. She spent most of her days in the sunroom, curled in a wool shawl, watching the fields, and one horse in particular. His name was Justice. A white stallion, strong and elegant, born on the estate and raised under her gentle hand. He wasn't broken by a whip like the others. Evelyn had trained him with kindness, whispers, apples, and patience. Justice had grown into a proud, noble creature with sharp eyes and a deep understanding of silence. He never needed reins to stay near her. Every morning, she'd shuffle out to the porch with her cane and whisper his name. And every morning, Justice would appear from the far pasture, trotting gently up to the fence. He'd lower his head, letting her fingers run through his mane, nuzzling her shawl like he understood her pain. Sometimes, that horse was the only one who listened. Inside the house, things were different. Victor didn't speak to Evelyn unless he had to. He didn't touch her anymore. At dinners, when they dined together, which was rare, he barely looked up from his plate. One evening, as a soft wind rattled the windows and Evelyn coughed quietly into her sleeve, she mustered the courage to speak. "Victor, would you sit with me for a while?" He didn't answer at first. "Just for a few minutes," she added. He let out a long breath. "I've got business to handle, Evelyn. You should be resting." "I'm always resting," she said, voice barely more than a whisper. I miss talking." Victor's jaw clenched. He rose from the leather chair by the fireplace and set down his glass. "You've had every comfort this house can offer. Don't start complaining now." Then he walked out, boots echoing down the hall. Evelyn looked back toward the window. In the distance, the shape of a white horse was standing still under a tree, watching the house. The next morning, she didn't have the strength to rise. The maid, a kind girl named Clara, brought her tea, but Evelyn couldn't hold the cup steady. Her fingers shook, her skin cold to the touch. "I'm fine," Evelyn lied. "Just a little tired today." Clara looked worried but said nothing. The help knew their place. That afternoon, Victor summoned the staff for a meeting in the dining hall. He had news. "There will be a gathering at the house this weekend," he announced. "Investors from Fort Worth, a few senators from Austin. Big names. We'll be hosting them for 3 nights." The butler nodded, writing notes on a pad. Victor's voice sharpened. "I want this house spotless. And I want my wife, out of sight." Silence. The cook glanced at Clara. The stable hand paused mid-polish of a silver tray. Victor caught the tension and added, "She's ill. It'll make the guests uncomfortable. She'll be moved to the east barn. The one with the insulated loft." "Fix it up." Clara gasped. "Sir, the barn? That's final," Victor snapped. "She'll be fine. You've got 2 days." No one dared speak again. Later that night, in the quiet of her room, Evelyn watched the shadows crawl along the ceiling. Her breath was labored. Her chest ached with every inhale. She had heard what Victor planned. She turned her face toward the window and whispered, "Justice." Outside, the horse was already there, standing still near the porch rail. The moonlight painted his coat silver. He didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Just watched. The next day, Evelyn was helped into a heavy coat and wheeled out toward the barn. Clara's hands trembled on the handles of the old wooden wheelchair. "This isn't right," she murmured. "You should be in bed, Miss Evelyn, not." "It's all right, dear," Evelyn said gently. "I'll be with Justice." The barn wasn't ready, no matter what Victor claimed. There was a loft with straw and a few wool blankets. But no heat. No medicine. Just old wood and the smell of hay. Justice followed them the whole way. Not a word was spoken about it. When Clara laid Evelyn down in the hay, wrapping her shawl tight, Justice stepped forward and curled beside her, like a guardian. Clara wept as she left, casting one last look over her shoulder. Victor didn't come. The stars were cold that night. Wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, and Evelyn shook from fever. She clung to the horse's side, his warmth the only thing between her and the dark. She whispered stories to him. Memories. Apologies. Her voice grew thinner with each hour. But Justice stayed still, breathing with her, his chest rising and falling like a lullaby. Outside, the world moved on. Music began to play in the mansion. A string quartet. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed through the fields. But in the barn, under a blanket of straw and silence, a different truth was being written. One that would not stay hidden for long. The morning after Evelyn was moved into the barn, the sun rose bright and indifferent. The grass sparkled with frost, the kind that crunched under boots. Inside the Hargrave mansion, Clara adjusted table settings for the guests while the scent of smoked ham and fresh biscuits filled the kitchen. The house had never looked so polished. But out in the east barn, the truth was far less elegant. Evelyn was barely awake. Her cheeks had lost what little color they held. Her breath rattled in her chest, lips dry, eyes too tired to open fully. She didn't complain. She never did. Justice lay beside her, motionless. His body curved protectively around her like a shield against the world. His thick white coat was damp from the dew. But he didn't move. Not once. When Tommy, the stable boy, peeked through the door to feed the horses, he froze. "Ma'am," he whispered, eyes widening. She turned her head slowly, and her voice came like paper tearing in the wind. "Tommy, could you bring me a cup of water?" The boy nodded, heart pounding. He didn't know what to do. He was just 16, good with animals but never trained for anything like this. Still, something in the way the white horse glanced at him, eyes deep and steady, gave him courage. He ran to the kitchen. Back in the mansion, the guests had begun to arrive. Victor greeted them at the grand front door with a perfect smile, his black vest snug, his silver cufflinks gleaming. He shook hands with a senator from Austin, clapped an investor from Dallas on the back, and ushered them into the drawing room where whiskey and cigars were waiting. "Your estate is just as impressive as I imagined," one of the men said. Victor laughed, feigning humility. "Well, I do what I can to keep the place respectable." No one asked about his wife. He made sure of that. Tommy returned to the barn with a tin cup of water and a piece of warm bread wrapped in cloth. Clara had slipped it to him when no one was looking. "She's still out there?" she'd asked, her voice low. Tommy had only nodded. Now, he knelt beside Evelyn, gently lifting her head to help her drink. Justice snorted softly beside them, as if approving. "You shouldn't be here alone, ma'am," the boy whispered. "I'm not alone," she murmured, her fingers brushing the horse's mane. He stayed. Tommy looked at the animal with awe. Justice hadn't eaten since yesterday. He hadn't left her side even once. It was unnatural, not in a magical way, but in a way that spoke of something deeper. Loyalty. Love. Grief, maybe. That evening, the wind picked up. Inside the mansion, music soared from the ballroom. A hired pianist played waltzes as Victor twirled a woman in emerald silk around the polished floor. His voice rang loud and smooth, charming everyone within earshot. Meanwhile, Evelyn's cough had worsened. Every few minutes, it racked her body like a wave crashing against fragile stone. Her blanket was soaked with sweat. Her skin burned with fever. Tommy returned again with a damp cloth and another small piece of bread, whispering apologies for not being able to do more. "Does he know?" Tommy finally asked her. She didn't respond at first. Then, barely audible, "He knows exactly what he's doing." Justice nudged her shoulder gently, like he understood the pain beneath her words. That night, a storm rolled in. The skies turned black and bellied with thunder. Lightning flickered in the distance like sparks behind a curtain. The barn creaked with every gust of wind. Rain began to pelt the rooftop. Victor closed the shutters in the mansion and poured himself another drink. "Should have built a new roof on that barn," he muttered to no one in particular. By midnight, water was seeping through the cracks in the ceiling. The straw beneath Evelyn's body was damp. Her breathing had become dangerously shallow. Her hands trembled, and her eyes fluttered open and shut like she was caught between sleep and something worse. Justice shifted beside her, unsettled. He whinnied, not loud, but sharp. And then he stood. His hooves thudded against the barn floor. He looked down at her for a long moment. Her eyes opened one more time. "Go," she whispered, barely more than breath. "Go, my love." Justice turned. He galloped through the barn door into the storm. The townsfolk were used to seeing Justice near the estate. He was known for his striking white coat and gentle nature. But seeing him racing alone through the rain-covered streets of Clayton Ridge at 2 in the morning? That was something else. He galloped past the saloon, past the church, past the sheriff's office, soaking wet, steam rising from his flanks, eyes wild and full of purpose. He didn't slow until he reached the house of Nurse Meredith Langley, the town's only registered nurse and a woman whose late husband once worked for Victor Hargrave, before he mysteriously vanished with unpaid wages. The old nurse was awake, boiling tea when she heard the frantic hooves outside. She peered out the window and gasped. "Justice," she whispered. The horse stood in the yard, soaked, panting, shaking his mane violently and stomping one hoof. She opened the door and stepped outside. "What is it? What's wrong?" Justice neighed and turned, trotting back the way he came, then stopping, turning back to look at her. She grabbed her shawl and boots. All right. I'm coming." She didn't know why she followed. Maybe instinct. Maybe anger. Or maybe some old part of her heart still believed animals knew more than men ever did. By dawn, Justice had led Nurse Langley, along with the sheriff, who she'd alerted on the way, and a handful of stunned townsfolk all the way back to the Hargrave estate. They arrived at the barn, out of breath and muddy, and what they saw stopped them cold. Evelyn lay pale and still in the hay. Her lips blue. Her skin clammy. But she was still alive. Just barely. Tommy was curled up nearby, sleeping in a pile of sacks. He'd stayed until exhaustion took him. The sheriff cursed under his breath. Dear God. Nurse Langley was already kneeling beside Evelyn, checking her pulse, tearing open her medical kit. "Get me hot water, blankets, and someone to carry her to my wagon," she barked. "Now." Justice stood beside them, silent and proud. Victor stumbled out of the house moments later, still tying his robe, eyes half closed. "What in hell's going on here?" he barked. Everyone turned. Nurse Langley stood up slowly. "She was left to die in your barn, Victor." The crowd was silent. Victor glanced at Justice, then at Evelyn being lifted gently into blankets. "She's ill." "It was better for everyone." "For you, maybe," the sheriff interrupted. "Not for her." Victor scoffed. "This is my land. My wife. You have no right." "I have every right," the sheriff growled. "You abused a sick woman. Endangered her life. You're coming with me." Victor's face turned crimson. You can't prove anything. Justice stepped forward and whinnied sharply. The horse's body stood between Victor and the townsfolk. A symbol. A witness. The crowd murmured. Everyone knew. Everyone had heard stories. But now they had proof. And a white horse who refused to be silent. They say animals don't speak. But in that moment, as the white stallion stood between Victor Hargrave and the townsfolk, no one needed words to understand what Justice was saying. He hadn't spoken in the language of men. He had spoken in the language of loyalty, of action, and that morning, his silence echoed louder than Victor's excuses ever could. Victor was dragged away in handcuffs. His robe flapped in the wind like a flag torn from its pole. He shouted, threatened lawsuits, named senators and judges he knew. But no one listened. Justice didn't move. He stood at the edge of the barn, watching as Nurse Langley cradled Evelyn's frail body in the back of her wagon, wrapped in wool blankets and heated bricks. Clara, who had run barefoot across the estate when she saw the sheriff's cart arrive, now knelt beside her, sobbing softly. Tommy, pale and wide-eyed, stood quietly behind Justice. His face was still damp from the tears he refused to shed in front of others. "Will she live?" the boy asked. The nurse looked up, her jaw tight. "If we're lucky, and fast." She snapped the reins, and the cart began rolling down the muddy hill toward town. Justice took one step forward as if to follow. Then another. At the edge of the property, the nurse pulled the wagon to a stop. She turned in her seat. "You coming with us, horse?" Justice let out a soft snort. The wagon moved on, and the white horse followed, step for step. Back in Clayton Ridge, word spread fast. A crowd had already gathered near the town clinic by the time Nurse Langley arrived. Some had heard the rumors. The white horse had woken the town. The millionaire's wife was found dying in the barn. The stallion had run through a storm to bring help. It sounded like legend. But the mud on the horse's legs, the red on Evelyn's lips, and the shame on Victor's name were very real. The sheriff gave a short statement outside the clinic. "Victor Hargrave is in custody. Charges are being filed. There will be a formal hearing." But the townspeople were less concerned with Victor and more concerned with the white horse who refused to leave the clinic steps. Justice stood outside the clinic for 3 days. He didn't eat. Didn't sleep. Barely drank. He only paced the porch, nudging the door every now and then, waiting for Evelyn. Tommy brought him apples and oats, but he rarely touched them. On the 4th day, Clara opened the clinic window and called softly, "Justice?" He lifted his head. "She's awake." The town square erupted. People clapped. Some cried. The blacksmith even rang his anvil bell as if announcing a wedding. But Justice didn't prance or whinny. He simply lay down in the grass beneath the window, head tucked under his chest, as if finally allowed to rest. Inside, Evelyn blinked slowly, the sunlight stinging her eyes. Her lips were chapped, her throat raw, but she whispered the first word she had spoken in days. "Justice." Clara sat beside her, holding her hand. "He's been waiting outside since the moment you arrived." Evelyn turned her head toward the window. Through the glass, she saw a familiar patch of white fur, still as snow. "Don't let them send him away," she murmured. "We won't," Clara promised. Nurse Langley nodded from the doorway. "That horse saved your life, Evelyn. Everyone here knows it." The town held a vote the next week. They didn't vote on Victor, the law would handle him. They voted on what to do with the Hargrave estate, now that Victor's assets were frozen and his fate uncertain. A proposal came from the blacksmith's wife, of all people. Turn the house into a healing home. For women like Evelyn. For anyone who's been silenced behind polished doors. No one objected. Another voice from the crowd shouted, "And the barn? Leave it open. Let the horse stay." A cheer went up. Justice returned to the estate with Tommy and Clara riding beside him. The barn was cleaned, repaired, and stocked with fresh hay. A new wood sign was nailed to the door. "Sanctuary, for those forgotten." Justice walked straight into his old stall, then turned and faced the open pasture, eyes watching the horizon like he always had. Evelyn returned a week later, her steps slow, her hands still weak, but her spirit visibly stronger. She stopped at the barn door and called his name. Justice turned, stepped forward, and pressed his forehead to hers. The crowd gathered behind her fell into respectful silence. No words were needed. That night, a bonfire lit the sky over Clayton Ridge. Families brought food. A fiddler played. Children danced in circles around the flame. Justice stood near the barn, tied with a ribbon of blue around his mane. Evelyn sat beside him in a rocking chair, blanket over her lap, smiling quietly as the wind moved gently through the grass. Tommy approached her with a question in his eyes. "Yes?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Do you think he knew? I mean, that something was wrong? That you needed help?" Evelyn looked at Justice, then back at the boy. "I think he knew long before I did," she said. "He just waited until I was ready to be saved." It was 2 weeks after Evelyn had returned to the estate when the letter arrived. Clara found it first, tucked beneath a saddlebag, half buried in the dirt near the old east barn. The leather was worn, the paper inside slightly damp, but the ink was still legible. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just 3 words across the front, written in a rough, hurried hand. "If I disappear." She turned it over and gasped. On the back was a wax seal, a faded H pressed into a smear of deep red. Hargrave. Clara brought it straight to Evelyn, who was sitting on the porch in the autumn sun with Justice standing behind her, head bowed. Evelyn read the letter once, then twice. Her hands trembled by the end. She looked up at Clara, eyes wide. "It's from William," she whispered. "William? As in?" "My brother. The one Victor said vanished." The letter was dated over a year ago. It detailed how William, once the estate's ranch manager and Evelyn's closest confidant, had discovered secret land deals Victor was orchestrating. Deals that redirected water from surrounding farms to expand his control. William had threatened to expose it. The letter read, "If you find this, Evelyn, it means I didn't make it. I think Victor suspects me. He's been watching. I overheard him telling a man in a black hat something about the ravine. If I vanish, promise me you'll never trust him again." At the bottom, a crude hand-drawn map, leading to the base of Clearwater Ravine. Evelyn handed the letter to Nurse Langley and the sheriff that same day. Justice watched the entire exchange, ears alert. By dawn, the sheriff, 2 deputies, Tommy, and the blacksmith rode out with Justice leading the way, Evelyn's insistence. Clearwater Ravine was a dry cut in the earth, sharp-edged, and filled with thorn brush. Few went down there, too steep, too wild. Justice didn't hesitate. He stopped at a rocky bend, near a weathered tree stump, and stomped his hoof 3 times. The sheriff dismounted. "There's something here," he said. With careful digging, they unearthed a small oilskin pouch, and inside it, a rusted belt buckle with the initials WH engraved on the underside. It was caked in dirt and dried blood. A few feet further, they uncovered bone fragments. A broken boot. A piece of a flannel shirt. It was enough. Enough to know that William Hargrave hadn't vanished. He'd been silenced. The sheriff returned to town and filed a new set of charges. Victor, still awaiting trial for endangerment and abuse, was now facing murder. When the news hit the papers, the tide shifted. The Hargrave name, once uttered with forced respect, became a warning. Evelyn sat quietly in the courthouse gallery when the evidence was presented. The letter. The belt buckle. The map. All tied together, not by a lawyer's brilliance, but by a horse's memory. The prosecutor closed with, "This case might never have been solved, had a white stallion not refused to walk away." The jury didn't take long. Victor Hargrave was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The courtroom buzzed, but Evelyn said nothing. She simply turned to Clara and whispered, "Justice kept his promise, even when I couldn't keep mine." That night, the town held another gathering, this time not for celebration, but for closure. A stone plaque was placed near the base of the hill, overlooking the ravine. It read, "In memory of William Hargrave, into justice, who never forgot." Back at the estate, Evelyn walked slowly through the barn with Clara and Tommy. Justice was already there, standing beside the empty stall where she had once slept, the straw still slightly flattened. "He remembered," Evelyn said. Tommy looked up. "Remembered what?" "He was there that night. The night William disappeared. I never knew, but I think Justice saw it all. Maybe he followed. Maybe he tried to stop it. Maybe he carried the guilt like I carried my silence." Her voice broke for a moment. Then she knelt beside the stall and pressed her forehead to the ground. "I'm sorry, William," she whispered. Justice stood quietly nearby, unmoving. The wind blew softly through the barn slats. Later that week, Evelyn made a decision. She met with the mayor, the sheriff, and the town council and donated full ownership of the Hargrave estate, every acre, every building, to the community. "I can't undo what was done," she said, "but I can plant something better in its place." The mansion would become a shelter for women and children escaping abusive homes. The barn would remain open to any animal or person in need. And Justice? He would never be ridden again. He would be the symbol. The guardian. The living reminder. On the first day the shelter opened, Evelyn stood at the front steps and cut the red ribbon with an old pair of shears from the barn. Dozens of townspeople clapped. A few cried. Justice stood behind her, wrapped in a ceremonial blue ribbon around his neck. And in that moment, with the sun rising over the hills and birds scattering across the sky, Evelyn said something that would be carved later into a brass plaque on the clinic wall. When the world turns its back, sometimes all it takes is one soul, loyal and silent, to run toward justice. The people agreed. But the horse had known it all along. Winter came early to Clayton Ridge. Snow touched the rooftops like icing sugar on gingerbread, and smoke curled from chimneys all across town. But on the Hargrave estate, now renamed the Sanctuary at Clearwater Ridge, the warmth came from more than just firewood. It came from laughter echoing in the halls of the old mansion, where women and children now found refuge. It came from the clatter of pots in the shared kitchen, the soft songs sung in hallways once filled with silence. And out in the pasture, where the east barn still stood tall, warmth came from a white stallion who had chosen not to leave. Justice had been offered homes, medals, even a place in a governor's parade, but Evelyn always refused on his behalf. "He's not a trophy," she told the press. "He's a friend. And he already has his kingdom." Evelyn's health had improved in ways no doctor could explain. She still walked slowly, sometimes with Clara's arm looped through hers, but her spirit was lighter. Stronger. Some said it was the clean air, others said it was the healing power of giving back. Evelyn said it was something simpler. Being seen, she told Nurse Langley one morning, can sometimes cure more than medicine ever will. She spent her days tending the herb garden behind the barn, journaling on the porch, and teaching the children how to brush Justice's mane without fear. He had become their legend, but he never acted like one. He still slept beside the old straw bedding where Evelyn had nearly died. Still walked the fence line at dawn. Still stood between visitors and the barn door until Evelyn nodded her quiet approval. One evening, near Christmas, Tommy brought Evelyn a wrapped bundle tied with a red ribbon. It was a leather journal, the first page bearing a pencil sketch of Justice drawn by one of the children. Below it, in neat handwriting, was the inscription: "To the horse who stayed, and the woman who survived." Evelyn smiled through tears. She looked out toward the pasture, where Justice stood under the pale moonlight, unmoving and proud. In January, the town held a public ceremony in the square. A bronze statue was unveiled, cast by a local artist who had spent months studying Justice's face, every curve and muscle. It stood on a small hillock, just outside the courthouse, where Victor had once walked free for years. The statue showed Justice standing with his head bowed, one hoof lifted, as if ready to move at any moment. At the base was carved a single sentence. Some heroes don't ride in. They stay. That afternoon, Evelyn gave a brief speech. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried. I used to believe strength meant standing tall and speaking loud. But I learned something else. Strength can mean staying beside someone, in the cold, in the dark, with no promise of reward. Strength can be silent. And that kind changes everything. The crowd applauded. Some wept. Some simply stood in silence, hands over hearts, as if understanding something sacred had just passed between them. Justice was there, of course, wearing a simple garland of winterberry around his neck. He didn't move much, didn't need to. He only watched. He always watched. In the years that followed, the sanctuary at Clearwater Ridge became a landmark, not for its size or its history, but for its spirit. Women from towns miles away arrived with nothing but a suitcase and left with purpose. Children who had known only fear learned to sleep soundly, curled against the barn walls with straw in their hair and smiles on their faces. And justice, aging gracefully, remained at the heart of it all. When he grew too old to patrol the fields, he rested more often. The townsfolk built a special open stall for him with a wide view of the hills. They called it the throne. And on the final summer of his life, as twilight stretched across the sky in soft gold and purple, Justice lay beneath the oak tree beside the barn, Evelyn resting gently against his side, her journal in her lap. No words were spoken. They didn't need to be. Justice passed quietly in the night. No thunder. No panic. Just a soft exhale under the stars. Evelyn found him the next morning, lying in his favorite spot. Peaceful. Whole. She didn't cry right away. She simply knelt and pressed her hand to his neck, whispering something no one else heard. Later that day, the barn was closed to visitors. The children made garlands from wildflowers. The stable hands dug a resting place beneath the oak. And when the sun set, the entire town gathered for the burial. No suits. No speeches. Just silence. And a single carved stone, placed at the foot of the tree. Here rests the one who never turned away. Final reflection. Years later, when Evelyn herself passed peacefully in her sleep, they buried her beside Justice, just as she had requested. A small sign was placed between them, simple and quiet. Together, they stayed. And by staying, they changed the world. The story of Justice and Evelyn became part of Clayton Ridge's soul. Children grew up hearing it. Travelers asked to see the barn, the statue, the tree. But more importantly, people remembered what it meant. That love doesn't always gallop in with fanfare. Sometimes, love simply stays, in the cold, in the silence, on a bed of straw. And sometimes, that's enough to save a life.